Hi, welcome to EES 112. This should be the first lecture that you listen to in this class. Today we are going to talk about the Planetary Boundaries framework. And a few things before you listen to this lecture. There are a number of readings posted for today, but I recommend that before you listen to this lecture, you read two of them. So one of them is the How to Read a Scientific Article. It's a pretty short reading, actually written by my colleague, Dr. Drips, that walks you through the different components of a scientific article, because the big focus of this class is going to be how do you understand primary scientific literature. So in this class, we do not use a textbook, we use all journal articles, and those can be very complicated and difficult to understand when you're new to the field. So that warm-up, how to read a scientific article, really describes what the different pieces of a scientific article are, what their function are, and to help you better understand it. And then the second thing that you should read is the Stefan et al. 2015 paper. So that paper will go over this, what is this planetary boundaries framework idea. It is the framework that we are going to base this entire course over. So we're going to spend the first week going through just some general groundwork, some basic concepts that of human impacts on the planet that are important to understand. And then we're going to move into, we're going to spend time on each individual boundary, right? So we're going to go through, there's 9 planetary boundaries, and we're going to go through all of them over the course of the class to really understand them a bit more in depth. So that's how we've structured this entire course in our department. And hence we start with this paper today on the planetary boundaries. So if you have not read those, the other papers on the Anthropocene, it's okay if you haven't read those prior to listening to this lecture, but you really need to first read the planetary boundaries paper, the Stefan et al. 2015 paper, before you listen to this. So if you haven't done that, go ahead, put this on pause, go read those, and come back and listen when you are ready. Okay, so here is the, we're going to talk about planetary boundaries. Okay, so the planetary boundaries. By now, you should understand that this is this framework, and it's a framework for understanding human impacts on the planet. And what we're going to do today in this lecture is we're going to walk you through the different components of the planetary boundaries framework, and at the same time, I'm going to walk you through the different components of a scientific paper to help you understand how to read the paper itself, and also how to understand a little bit more in depth the kind of key data in the paper, which is going to be your figures and your tables. Oops, slide advance. Okay. So I left this in here, even though we're not in a classroom. And the reason I left this in here is because if you're listening to this after our first meeting, you will now have 1 or 2 people in class that you can partner up with to do these kinds of activities. And so I'm going to leave them, and you know, throughout the class, I'm going to be giving you prompts, sometimes during the lectures, other times during in activities that are uploaded online, where I want you to go ahead and get together on Zoom, Google Meets, whatever Skype, whatever sort of online interface that you can use to talk through the material. And the reason for this is that the best way to absorb the material is through actually processing it with another person. And so since you can't be in class, you can at least simulate that, there we go. You can at least simulate that situation through partnering with your small group in class. So these are the kinds of things that would be good for you to do in those discussions. Hence the prompt I'm going to go ahead and leave in there. And also, if you have not yet found it, note that there are slides posted. So the planetary boundaries slides are posted under today's work so that you can follow along with those slides while you listen to this lecture. Okay, so kind of the first thing you should notice about an article is the abstract. So what does an abstract do? An abstract is just a simple summary of the article. I often describe to students that scientists are a bit of lazy readers. If you look at how a scientific article is written, it is written in a way that gets the information quickly and easily into the reader's hands, so that you can understand a whole lot of the article without even diving into all of the details, right? And sadly enough, oftentimes you will find that scientists read each other's articles and are really picking out key pieces of it that they want to read. So for example, I might look for an article in my field that uses a particular methodology, but maybe they applied it to something that I'm really a little less concerned with understanding. In that case, I might really dive into the materials and methods sections of the article and kind of not pay a whole lot of attention to the rest, right? Conversely, I might be really new to a field and just trying to understand kind of the groundwork of that field. In that case, I'm going to look for articles that are often in kind of summarizing information broadly across the field. And a lot of those we're going to read in this class because you all are pretty new to this field. And in that case, I also might, and this was mentioned in the reading, I also might just sort of skim through the methods, because I trust that they know this field. They know what they're doing a whole lot better than me. I'm not an expert in this field. And so I just kind of trust they know what they're doing. And a lot of the technicalities, the methods might not make a whole lot of sense. But I'm going to pay a lot of attention to the introduction where they're framing the general concepts and then the results in the discussion of those articles, right? So one of the reasons a science article is kind of chopped up into these pieces is to help people identify where the most important information might be for them. So an abstract is a summary. It gives us a pretty good overview of what the entire article is about. And depending on the article, this article doesn't have this because this article is a compilation of data from sort of across the field. However, in some cases, when it's kind of an original research article, you will find that an article will have, as part of it, the main methods and results and conclusions that they drew in this article, okay? So here we see that this is going to be an article about the Planetary Boundaries framework. We see that it's a revised and updated framework, right? They're going to revise and they're going to update it, which means that there's another paper where this was proposed. And in fact, Rockstrom and others in 2009 proposed the original framework. And you will see the video that you were pointed to today was the Rockstrom talking about the original Planetary Boundaries framework. So I believe in that video, you're going to see a slightly different framework than the one we're looking at today. And partly that's because that would be the original framework. Okay, so we're going to also see here that they're going to identify two core boundaries, right? So climate change and biosphere integrity. And these being the core boundaries, which has the potential to drive the Earth system into a new state, okay? All right, so I'm jumping ahead to figure 3, and then we're going to go back to figures 1 and 2. So figure 3, this is a depiction of the 9 planetary boundaries, okay? The type of chart shown here is called a radar plot or radar chart. And what you're seeing are normalized, so just sort of standardized values of each of the variables that's being measured for the 9 planetary boundaries, and how those are distributed across these different tiers of the planetary boundaries. So in this immediate first gray circle, we're seeing the area that they're calling the planetary boundary. That's the green space. So when any one of these given boundaries is within this green space, it is within the planetary boundary, okay? So it's in the safe and operating space for that boundary. And then as you move into this yellow space, right, which is going to be shown by the second gray tier, we've moved into what's called the zone of uncertainty. That's where you're going to have increasing risk and increasingly unknown consequences of moving further into that space. And then finally, there's this red zone, which is going to be the zone of high risk or beyond the zone of uncertainty. When we are in this zone, we know we're in a really dangerous space for the planet, okay? So each one of these boundaries right, is going to have a variable that we're measuring. And we'll get to that in a little bit later because it's easier to show you on the chart. But for each boundary, there's a variable that's going to be measured, and according to the quantity of that variable, we'll know where we are within the boundary, okay? Just want to point out here, this thing right here, right? This thing right here is called a caption, all right? So in a figure, you're going to see the caption typically below the figure. That's where it's going to be placed. So later on in this class, you're going to be doing lab reports. I'm going to ask you to make figures and write a caption. You put the caption for a figure below that figure, okay? If you look at the different pieces of the caption, right? So it's going to have a figure and a number. The number is just the order that it's written in the paper. And then you have this part in bold. It's not always in bold, but it's in bold here. This part in bold here is really the title for the figure. Now notice, when you were in elementary school, your teacher made you like make a chart and put a big title up there, probably middle school and high school as well. When you're publishing in a scientific journal, none of them do that. You don't have a title above your figure, at least very rarely. I'm sure someone can find an exception to that rule, but very rarely would anyone have that. Rather, this first sentence is actually the title. The current status of the control variables for 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, period. Notice that's actually a sentence fragment that we put a period at the end of. It's actually the title, okay? So it's a long descriptive title of what you're seeing there. If the title is not enough, we give more information. So what is in an abstract, or I'm sorry, an abstract. What is in the caption? You should have all of the information that you need in order to read the figure, okay? So for example, they put down here, what is this green space? What is the yellow space? What is the red space? Where's the planetary boundary, right? Why are they all kind of on the same thing? Because one wouldn't measure climate change the same way they measure biogeochemical flows. Oh, that's because it's been normalized for the zone of uncertainty, right? So essentially the variables have been transformed so they can be compared to one another on the same sort of scale. And then there's just a little bit more information of what we, kind of things that you might want to know. So for example, like, oh, there's question marks in the figure. What does that mean? Well, down here it says processes for which the global level boundaries cannot yet be quantified are represented by gray wedges. In other words, we don't know how to measure these yet, okay? So these are the different components of the planetary boundaries framework. Note that there are these bold things, or the bold writing is the boundaries, right? So we have biosphere integrity, land system change, freshwater use, biogeochemical flows, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosol loading, stratospheric ozone depletion, novel entities, and climate change. Biosphere integrity and biogeochemical flows each have subcategories for the overall boundary. So what they're saying is there isn't really one thing we can measure to understand this boundary. We don't have kind of one good proxy of measurement. So instead we're going to measure these two things, functional diversity and genetic diversity. And it turns out we don't even know how to measure functional diversity, but we know genetic diversity is in trouble. We'll get to that at the end of the class, the end of the entire course, I should say. Same thing with biogeochemical flows. Well, nitrogen and phosphorus appear to be equally important, so we really need to understand both of these elements of the boundary, okay? All right, so going back to figure 1, so this is the first figure that they should have shown you. This article was a little funny because it had the summary page, but then once you're actually reading the article, this would have been the first figure that you came across. And I find that students have the hardest time understanding this figure, right? So let's go ahead and kind of look at the different components of it and try to make sense of it together. So figure 1, the conceptual framework for the planetary boundary approach, showing the safe operating space. Well, now we know that's the green zone, the zone of uncertainty, and the position of the threshold, where one is likely to exist, and the area of high risk. Okay, so what is this showing me? This is showing me that there's some idea of a threshold or a point after which we're going to be in a lot of trouble, okay? And so let's pause for a second and think about let's break down this idea of a threshold, and then we'll come back to this figure. Okay, so this is a bowling cup diagram, and you're going to see this again throughout the course. So pay attention here. And this is one way of understanding a sort of abstract concept we have called resilience. And one of the concerns that environmental scientists have about the planet is that we are losing our resilience in our current state, right? So that the planet as we now know it is sort of starting to move into a different regime, right? So we have a certain way that ecosystems operate, the climate operates, nutrient cycles throughout the planet, and that's been going on for a long time, and humans have adapted to this, and we've learned how to survive within this regime. And the concern is that we are losing resilience, and that we have the possibility that this regime, let's imagine that we're living in this regime right here, will actually move into a new space and a new regime, and humans will have to adapt if we're going to survive in that new regime, right? But because we know how to survive here, we kind of want to keep ourselves in the current regime, okay? So the depth of this cup is what we call the resilience of a system, right? So how the resilience being the ability of a system to kind of maintain the same state and the same function in the space of change, okay? So and there's a definition for you, okay? And so what happens through human environmental damage, we lose this social ecological resilience. And then with any sort of disturbance, we're likely to throw the system into a new stage, okay? So sometimes when we're trying to do things efficiently, we lose our resilience. And then a trigger will happen and we have a regime shift into a new state, okay? And actually, going back to this idea of efficiency and losing resilience, I think we have a really pertinent example right now, which, you know, sadly has to do with our situation with COVID, right? And this is actually in the case of economic efficiency, right? So for economic efficiency, we kind of have this ideal number of hospital beds and ideal numbers of medicine, and it's to be kind of use our resources efficiently in any given moment. But what happens when there's a major disturbance? Well, we actually can't, we've lost resilience. We don't have enough of everything across the system to be able to withstand the shock. And it's one of the sort of things that we've been really struggling with now, is we're seeing all the ways in which our system kind of didn't have a lot of resilience because we'd reduced, in order to have resilience, you kind of need repetitive functions. And we're going to get back to that at the end of the class when we talk about ecological systems. So when we've lost some repetitive functions in the name of efficiency, we've actually lost our resilience as a system. And that makes it harder to recover from a major disturbance or trauma to the system. And so what can happen is you can flip into a new state. So we would consider that to be passing a threshold, right? So when we get back to that diagram, when you think of the threshold, it's that ball rolling over that hill and then it goes in a new state. And if you want to get back, it's going to take a whole lot of energy to get that ball back into that new state, and it still might not be that stable there again, right? And so that's the idea of kind of a systems understanding of resilience and the planet. Okay, so moving back to this figure, what are they showing you here? What they're showing you is that some things are going to have this continental or global threshold, where as you, let's say you go ahead and you're polluting and you're polluting and you're polluting and the planet seems fine and nothing really seems to be happening, well, then you hit this threshold and the ball starts rolling into this new state and the system is breaking down and the things that would normally keep the system in check have fallen apart, and now you're into an entirely new state and it would be very difficult and potentially even impossible to recover from, right? And then there's a difference here of scale. Some of these things are going to be operating on a local scale. You might hit a local threshold, but on a global scale, you know, maybe you're here on this local scale and the system is completely fallen apart, but on a global scale, you're just inching along little by little. So what's maybe a potentially good example of this? Let's think about regional impacts of deforestation and forest loss. You can collapse a regional ecosystem, right? You can think of your original prairies along some of the Great Plains that could have completely collapsed, but there's still broader planetary biodiversity, and we might only be, you know, moving along to this level here, right? And so there's going to be feedbacks from a global scale influencing a local scale, and the local scale is going to be slowly, incrementally influencing a global scale, okay? So this is the idea of there's going to be different processes happening at different scales in different regions, and collectively, these are influencing what's happening in the complex dynamic system that is our planet. And if that's giving you a little bit of a headache at this point, it probably should, because you're trying to conceptualize all of these different processes happening on the planet on different times and in different regional scales. And that's what environmental scientists are trying to do. And it is a difficult thing to wrap your head around. And we're going to look at some of the really amazing modeling that environmental scientists have been able to do over the course of you know, the last half a century in particular. Okay, so back to this figure here, right? So we have our 9 planetary boundaries. We have our caption here. And what I want you to notice here is that some of these are already beyond the planetary boundary. So I'm going to speak a little bit slowly here so that you can think through it as you're watching it. And ask yourself, which of these planetary boundaries have passed the planetary boundaries? So which of the 9 planetary boundary variables are beyond the planetary boundary? You should be seeing, oh, I thought I had them highlighted. You should be seeing, let's see, let's use the highlighter function. You should be seeing here, land system change, biogeochemical flows, climate change, and biosphere integrity, okay? So these 4 boundaries have all moved beyond the planetary boundary, okay? So we've moved these 4 beyond the planetary boundary. The why, right? Because remember here, the zone of uncertainty, so if you got it wrong, you probably just pointed to biosphere integrity and biogeochemical flows. And forgot that when you're in the yellow zone, you're also beyond the planetary boundary. Now, if you've been following this far, hopefully you're asking yourself, but wait, why? Because we don't actually know, is that the terrible zone we can't recover from, or are we in a new state, or are we not when we're in the yellow zone? Well, that's good point. We don't actually know yet. But we're following something that we call the precautionary principle. So environmental scientists do not usually align themselves with a camp that says, don't worry about it, humans will find a way to fix it. Because of the complexity of the Earth system that they're studying, they don't trust that humans are going to be able to come up with a technology necessarily to fix all of the complexities of the planet. So their position is, let's be safe. Let's err on the side of precaution and keep the planet in a place where it will be able to correct itself, and not push it outside of these boundaries where we might be entering an irrecoverable state. Now, I also want to remind you of that abstract. In the abstract, they said there were a couple boundaries that might be pushing us into an entirely new zone with no ability to recover, right? And they pointed out biosphere integrity and climate change. And I'm going to actually kind of maybe highlight that land system change and biosphere integrity and climate change are going to kind of speak. They're going to be very strongly influencing each other, because here we're thinking about things like habitat, which impacts, you know, our biosphere integrity, and the climate is going to be impacting habitat as well. And so these are things that are going to be, constantly speaking to each other. So the boundaries are going to be impacting each other. And one variable, let's imagine climate change going into a dangerous zone, very well could cascade across other boundaries, particularly things like ocean acidification and freshwater use, and impact other aspects of the planet. Okay, so let's talk about tables. A table is fundamentally different from a figure. A figure should be a visually appealing, hopefully easily understand drawing that's done with data, okay? So sometimes figures are entirely conceptual, and they usually will throw in the word conceptual when they are. And that means that they're not based in data, they're more based in a concept. At other times, and probably most of the time, figures are going to be visual depictions of the data that scientists collected, right? So what's a table? A table are the actual numerical values of what scientists collected, right? And one of the biggest errors I have in introductory level classes is when I ask students to make a table out of, let's say we collect data in a lab, and I say, go ahead and make a table of this data. And you all give me everything that you collected, right? That's not what you're seeing here. You're not seeing all of the information that scientists collected throughout this project. What you're seeing is key pieces of very interesting information that they thought you might want to see the numerical value of. If they put their entire data table in here, it would be a giant headache. And actually, I'll give you an experience with that in one of the labs in this semester, okay? So instead, it's distilled, targeted information, but where the actual numerical values were sometimes, because I'm a social scientist, sometimes it's actually you can have text data as well, so the qualitative values or understanding of the data can also go in a table, okay? So I think of tables often as kind of a more detailed level of information. And so what you're seeing here are the values of the control variables according to the planetary boundary and where we are at, right? So if you see here, this is our caption for the table. Hopefully you were listening before and you're saying, wait a minute, that's above the table. And she gave this big speech about how it was below the figure. Well, that's right. The caption of a table goes above the table. The caption for a figure typically will go below the figure. Okay? Every now and then you'll be reading a journal article where they put it off to the side, but the sort of standard is what I just told you. Caption for the table, above the table, caption or figure, below the figure. Okay, so we have the Earth system process. The figure is much longer, or the table is much longer than this. I'm just gonna walk you through this piece of it, and you can spend a little bit more time on your own looking back at the overall table. So here is our Earth system process, right? What are we trying to understand? Well, we're trying to understand the climate change process, right? Control variable, well, what can we measure to understand this process? Well, let's measure atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million. Planetary boundary, where do we need to be in order to stay below, below the planetary boundary, right? So the planetary boundary is at 350 parts per million carbon dioxide. And then your zone of uncertainty, in parentheses, would be between 350 and 450. Beyond 450, we would be beyond the zone of uncertainty. Okay, so what is the current value of the control variable? Now remind you, this was written in 2015, probably took, I'm gonna guess, a year to go through peer review. So this data is based probably around 2014 data. And this would be, I'd have to look at the details in the article, but I'm willing to bet that this would be the average carbon dioxide concentration in the year, okay? When we get to climate change, you're going to learn that carbon dioxide concentration fluctuates up and down throughout the year. So this would be the average over the year. Okay, so at that time, we were within the zone of uncertainty and beyond this planetary boundary because it is higher than 350. I can tell you we are not yet beyond 450 average throughout the year, but we are well beyond this number. At the very lowest point that we recorded, I believe it was 2 years ago, was 400. Okay, and that was the low point throughout the year. So the average over the course of the year is steadily moving higher from this. Okay, so then you can trace this across the different variables that are part of the planetary boundaries framework. Okay, figure 2. What is the purpose of this figure? Well, first of all, you should note that you're looking at the globe, and the same red, yellow, and green colors are being distributed off the globe. So hopefully you're starting to see, oh, they've taken the planetary boundaries and they've mapped it according to regions. Because in figure 1, I showed you, hey, there's interactions between local level impacts and global level impacts. And here they're showing you for 4 of the major planetary boundaries, particularly those that are going to have more localized versus globalized differences. How do we understand the local versus global impacts, right? So, for example, phosphorus and nitrogen. We know that at a global level, we're beyond the planetary boundary. But if you note that it's actually really focused on certain areas of the globe, and much of the globe is below the boundary. Okay, so this sort of, if you want to think of it as the impacts, but also potentially the problem, depending on how we understand that problem, is localized to certain areas, but across the globe, we can expect to see cascading effects, right? Land system change. Again, we see here that we're beyond the zone of uncertainty in some areas, and we're at an increasingly high risk in others. And then in other areas, we still seem relatively okay, right? If you notice where we're at here in the Southeast, which makes sense if you understand our current land distribution patterns. Okay, freshwater use. This one usually kind of surprises students in class because we talk a lot about freshwater use, right? But if you noticed on the planetary boundaries, it's actually one of the few boundaries that's still below the boundary. And this map really shows us why it's such an issue if it's overall below the boundary. And that's because in areas of high population density, we often have acute freshwater use problems. Either a lack of access to fresh water or periods throughout the year where we don't have enough fresh water. So again, if we think about it on a global scale, it's actually a closed system and there is plenty of fresh water across the globe. But at these local scales, we might be experiencing freshwater crises at any given point in time. Okay, so one last point I want to make about this article that you read for today in terms of the planetary boundaries. They talked about moving out of the Holocene at some point in this paper, and this is going to be a big focus of the next papers that you read about the Anthropocene. So as you move on to the Crutzen and the Stefan et al. 2007 paper, I think, you're gonna see several references to the Holocene. So what's the Holocene? The Holocene is this geological epoch that we've been in for approximately the last 10,000 years. So that I just highlighted here. If you look, and we're going to look at some of this data when we get to climate and climate change, if you cast back, 100,000 years, you're going to see variations in changes in temperature and climate throughout time, right? So the Earth changes, our climate changes. We all know that there were dinosaurs on the Earth before and they're not here anymore, and that we have had, ice in places that are warm now. And so the Earth is a very, it's a changing system. However, the last 10,000 years really represents the entirety of modern human civilization. If you look at our anthropological records, which I hope I've mentioned by now that I'm an anthropologist. If you look at our anthropological records, you will see that actually across the world, most of these things of modern civilization that we have record of really are within the last 10,000 years. And we believe that it's this relatively stable climate that has actually allowed us to develop such an advanced system, particularly advanced agricultural system that has allowed us to sustain the enormous populations that we have today. So why are scientists worried? Because it seems that everything that we're doing to the planet is actually pushing us out of the Holocene, right? Into a state that is unknown. And so that is, climates tend to change over really broad timescales. And there's some fear that we were going to change the planet faster than we can actually adapt to the impacts that we're making. Okay, so you're going to be reading about this if you haven't already, but this is called the Great Acceleration. This is broadly known as the period from about 1950 to present, when you see this exponential growth in human impacts on the planet. So when you look at the article on the Anthropocene, you're going to see these fabulous charts that show you exponentially growing human impacts on the planet, from everything to water pollution, to appropriation of net primary productivity, which is the amount of sort of plant life we are taking our energy from. And then you're going to see things like McDonald's, growth in McDonald's signs, growth in tourism, and they're all on this exponential growth curve. And this has been termed by, again, Earth environmental scientists, the Great Acceleration, which is this period where we've been on exponential growth of human impacts on the planet. And this is closely tied into our human economic system. And the question is, if you study math, an exponential growth curve cannot go on forever, right? Especially at some point, it will have to level out, you'll run out of resources, you'll collapse. And so one of the things that environmental scientists have been trying to do is slow down this acceleration to avoid collapse. Okay, so you're going to come across this term, the Anthropocene. We're going to talk about this a lot in the class. It's this idea that now the human footprint, if you will, or impact on the planet is so great that humans are now the great driving forces of the planet. And so there's this idea that we've really moved out of the Holocene and we're into the Anthropocene. Within that, it is very sort of anthro means human, right? So it's this human-dominated epoch, geological epoch. And the idea is, can we, right, if humans are dominating the planet, then humans are going to need to take some sort of behavioral change to reduce our impact on the planet so that we can continue to thrive within the constraints of the planet itself. All right. So that is your first lecture on planetary boundaries. From here, you should be now kind of, I would recommend that you go back to the article and relook at those figures and try to make sure that you can make sense out of them. If there are still some things that are confusing, dive back into those certain aspects of either the lecture or actually, so you can repeat play it, which is nice, or actually into the specific parts of the text that are describing it. And then I'll also post sort of under each day, I'm going to just post a general questions box. So after you spend that time, if you're still like, I don't know what's going on, type your question in the questions box. That's always better than just emailing me, because when you email me, I'll answer you, but then you're the only person getting that answer. And I'm willing to bet that if you're confused on something, someone else in the class is too. So this way we can kind of share points of confusion and clarify all together. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening this far. And we will pick up the topics again in the next lecture. All right, bye-bye.